Another story that is going around and trying to make sense of it. Some people are going to say, Viva, why aren't you talking about the inclusion of the anti-BDS provision in the DHS guidelines for attributing federal funds? I want to make sure that things are accurate or even true before I start looking into them, analyzing and formulating an opinion, let alone trying to inform others on it. The news that broke yesterday is that the Trump administration was predicating the allocation of federal funds for things like FEMA, federal emergency, whatever, relief, predicating it on corporations not engaging in boycotts of Israel. And I wasn't sure if it was accurate, and I wanted to wait a little bit for the news to evolve and the information to come out, or at least be able to find it. And today's the day where I feel comfortable enough to talk about the situation and how, if ever such a provision was in fact included in the guidelines for the federal government allocating emergency relief funds, you all know, unless you're very new to the channel or suffer from serious ideological blinders, I do not support the idea of prohibiting boycotts. Period. I think it's, other than the fact that it's unconstitutional, although you're going to say the government can, decide who and what it wants to support, it's counterproductive above all else. If your goal is to try to not have people have overt or implicit resentment for identifiable groups of people, religions, or nations, what you don't do is impose legislation to protect those groups of people, races, religions, creeds, or nations. Like, one of the biggest reasons why there's such animosity towards the 2S LGBTQIA plus community is specifically because of the preferences and the legislative protections that treat certain classes of people as better than others, or as more requiring protection than others. Natalie Winters does amazing work. I listened to her on Bannon this morning. Put out a tweet that said, new White House official tells me DHS guidelines, the Department of Homeland Security guidance, has been updated to show no Israel requirement. It still bars recipients from operating programs that benefit illegal immigrants. Okay. I'm going to show you something here, because this was the original, or at the very least, this was the provision of this guidance, which we're going to get to in a second. The impugned provision, anti-discrimination. Recipients must comply with all federal applicable anti-discrimination laws material to the government's payment decisions for purposes of 31 USC. Definitions as used in this clause: DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion; DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Discriminatory equity ideology has the meaning set forth in section here and here. D, discriminatory prohibited boycott means refusing to deal, cutting commercial relations, or otherwise limiting commercial relations specifically with Israeli companies or with companies doing business in or with Israel, or authorized by, licensed by, or organized under the laws of Israel to do business. It's so obviously legislatively improper, ideologically counterproductive. And the question I always ask is, what's next? All right, we won't give you money if you boycott Israel or Israeli companies. Well, what is next? Like a legislative provision requiring companies to do business with Israeli companies or whatever? So that was the original provision, which struck people as being highly offensive. This is, according to Natalie, the new version, which removes that specific provision of the anti-boycott. The only problem is the one that gets cut off there, E, or underneath, might be relevant. So I went and pulled up the guidance. Let me see where I put the guidance here. I picked it up and it's right here. I went and got the guidance for the fiscal year 2025 DHS standard terms. Get this out of here. And conditions. The fiscal year 2025. Now, just so everybody appreciates what this document is. It's the, how do we describe this? Official policy document from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Outlines standard terms and conditions that apply to all DHS financial assistance awards, grants, cooperative agreements for the fiscal year 2025. That's the legal, administrative, financial requirements that all recipients of DHS funding must follow. It applies to disaster relief funds. It covers disaster relief funds not directly, but indirectly, because it applies to all financial assistance awards issued by DHS components like FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. All right, good. Now we understand what it is. Fiscal year, Department of Homeland Security standard terms and conditions apply to all new federal awards of federal financial assistance for which the federal award date occurs in fiscal year 2025 and flow down to subrecipients unless a term, yada, yada, yada. For federal, okay, fine. Let's go down to where the provision that we thought had been removed may or may not have been removed. I'm just going to go like this. Look for boycott. Okay, here we go. Section 12. Of course, that was the section. Anti-discrimination. Recipients must comply with all applicable federal anti-discrimination laws material to the government's payment decisions for purposes of section. And here, this is the version, by the way, that is April 18. This is the one that's still live on the internet. I can give you all the link because I sometimes feel like I'm taking crazy pills. This is the version that's still live on the internet that seems to still have this particular provision, just say stuck in it, not snuck in there, but stuck in there. Now, Disclose TV, let me bring this out. Disclose TV put out a link, which I called more ping pong than anything else. I'm going to keep this up. No, I'm going to close it. We don't need this anymore. I gave you all the link. I put out a tweet that said, this version is still live on the internet. I don't understand where the edit apparently has come. And Disclose TV put out a tweet which said back and forth. It's in, it's out, it's in, but there was still a problem in terms of what might still be in. It's a tweet thread. So the original one was just in Trump to withhold disaster funding for states and cities who boycott Israel per Reuters. And then their quote tweeted themselves. It says Trump admin conditions 1.9 billion in FEMA disaster funding on states and cities not boycotting Israel. Okay, fine. Then they quote tweet themselves a little bit later. And it says just in. Trump DHS stealth edits reversal of withholding disaster funds for states and cities who boycott Israel. Reuters. Then a little bit later, it says Trump reportedly lifted restrictions on disaster funds for states and cities boycotting Israel, but the revised DHS documents keeps the vague term, quote, discriminatory prohibited boycott, end quote, originally defined as boycotting Israel. And then we can see here, we can see it, that it still includes the provision that they do not, granting of awards, that they do not engage in and will not, during the term of this award, engage in a discriminatory prohibited boycott. What does that mean is going to be the question. Why is it still the older version that's still live on the internet is the question. And how is that going to be interpreted? Now, people out there rightly concerned saying, well, they've just taken out the direct prohibition and they've included one that's going to be the indirect way of getting exactly what they wanted, but removing the direct prohibition, so it'll be palatable or at least sneak it by. We'll see, and to be determined. I can understand what that prohibition means if they're going to say, like, we're not going to give federal funds to corporations which boycott countries, say, because of racial reasons. We're not going to give assistance to corporations that engage in prohibited boycotts that are based on race, religion, creed, ethnicity, whatever. I can imagine them saying, look, a company is going to boycott Rwanda because it doesn't want to do business with a black country. I can understand the federal government saying, well, we're not going to sanction that because that's prohibited based on existing discrimination or anti-discrimination laws in America. Where it becomes problematic is if you say country specific under the pretext that it would necessarily be religiously motivated, that you can't boycott Israel in as much, you could boycott China. Hell, they have sanctions on China and Russia. But you can't boycott Israel because it would necessarily be an anti-Semitic boycott. That's a problem. The idea that you could boycott Canada, even though it's an ally of America in theory, and that would be okay because there's no nation state, ethnic, ideological, racial, religious identity of Canada. You can boycott Canada. You can boycott every country on earth. But if you decide to boycott Israel for whatever your ideological reasons are, it's necessarily anti-Semitic and therefore discriminatory. That's a very big problem. And it's an interesting thing as to why anyone thought it was a good idea to predicate disaster relief for states on whether or not they engage in anti-Israel boycotts. I mean, that is so oddly specific for the benefit of one country in particular to be included in federal guidance, federal policy. that if your goal is actually to protect the business relations with that country, you would want to do the exact opposite. You would want to treat them on par with every other country on earth, not create special rules that are going to piss people off and say, why that country and not, for example, Poland. But at the very least, now we have the details. It looks like there was sufficient blowback. And this was what Natalie Winters was saying on Bannon. Like, the administration listens. Who the hell tried to sneak that in? I would be looking for saboteurs because it's so in your face and egregious. I do not believe anybody could have thought it was a good idea, even if what you wanted to do was protect Israel. Set that aside. Who thought it was a good idea to put it in there? It's either sabotage or very, very poor judgment by an administration. They listened to the blowback and they took it out. Now, the only question is whether or not they found a backdoor, indirect way of doing indirectly what people were outraged they tried to do directly. To be seen, to be determined. Keep an eye out. That's where we're at right now. When the revised version takes precedent over the version that's online right now, that's live, I'm also going to be following, because as far as I can see, that provision is still in the version that is live on the internet, on the government's website right now as we speak. I gave you the link.